September 19th, 1944. Rolling farmland 3 kilometers east of Arracourt, France, Captain Kenneth Lamison squinted through the fog-thickened dawn, watching the grey shapes materialize on the road below. 8 Panthers, factory fresh by the look of their paint, advancing in column formation toward his thinly held defensive line. His 4 Sherman tanks sat hull down behind the ridgeline at Bezange-la-Petite, their 75mm guns trained on empty air where German armor would appear in approximately 3 minutes. The mathematics were brutal, and Lamison knew them by heart. A Panther's frontal armor measured 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, effectively immune to his Shermans at any practical range. The German gun could penetrate his tanks from 2,000 meters. His gun couldn't scratch a Panther's glacis plate even at point-blank range. The Panther weighed 45 tons against his Sherman's 33. It mounted a high-velocity 75mm Cubic 42 that could cut through American armor like tissue paper. German tactical doctrine was built on these certainties. Engage at maximum range, use superior firepower and protection to destroy American medium tanks before they could close. The Panthers advancing toward Lamison's position that morning expected to fight the American way, trading shots at distance where German technical superiority decided everything. But Lamison had arrived at this ridge 3 minutes before the Germans. 3 minutes to position his tanks, 3 minutes to identify the killing zone, 3 minutes that would prove the difference between a technical advantage and a tactical massacre. What happened in the next 12 minutes would confuse German intelligence analysts for the rest of the war, because when the fog finally cleared and German recovery teams examined the wreckage, they would find 8 destroyed Panthers and 4 intact Shermans that shouldn't have survived the engagement. The Americans had changed something fundamental about how they fought, something the Germans would never decode. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn mist hung over Lorraine like a burial shroud that September morning, but the weather was the least of Lieutenant General George Patton's problems. His Third Army had torn across France in a 6-week blitz that left German commanders reeling and Allied logistics in chaos. By mid-September 1944, Patton's armored spearheads had driven so far, so fast, that his supply lines couldn't keep pace. His tanks were running on fumes, his infantry was fighting on half rations, and somewhere in the fog-shrouded hills east of the Moselle River, German high command was preparing the counterattack that would either validate or destroy everything Patton had accomplished since Normandy. The strategic situation was stuck. Patton's 12th Corps, commanded by Major General Manton Eddy, had pushed deep into Lorraine, establishing bridgeheads over the Moselle and threatening the German industrial heartland beyond. The advance had been spectacular, audacious, and completely unsustainable. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every replacement tank had to travel hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches through a logistics network that was buckling under the strain of supporting multiple Allied armies racing eastward. German intelligence had identified the vulnerability. Patton's forward elements were extended, exposed, and starving for supplies. His 4th Armored Division, the tip of his spear, sat in a vulnerable salient around the small farming village of Arracourt, 40 kilometers east of Nancy. The terrain was agricultural, gently rolling hills and patches of woodland that offered concealment for armor. Perfect country for the kind of mobile armored warfare the Germans had perfected in Poland and France 4 years earlier. Now they would use those same tactics to cut off and destroy the American advance. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the counteroffensive. On September 1st, 1944, he had appointed General Hasso von Manteuffel to command the 5th Panzer Army, with explicit instructions to halt Patton's advance and recapture the ground lost since D-Day. Manteuffel was competent, experience, and working with resources that barely existed. His armored force consisted of two newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, plus elements of the battered 11th Panzer Divisions scraped together from the wreckage of the summer's defeats. The German force looked impressive on paper. 262 tanks and assault guns, including 107 brand-new Panther tanks, fresh from the factories. The Panther represented the peak of German armored design, incorporating lessons learned from encounters with Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Its sloped frontal armor was proof against most Allied tank guns at combat ranges. German crews had learned to use these advantages ruthlessly, engaging from hull-down positions at distances where American return fire was ineffective. But Monteufel's impressive-looking force concealed fatal weaknesses. The Panzer brigades were equipped with new tanks, but manned by inexperienced crews. Most had received less than 6 weeks of training. They had never worked together as units. Their commanders were learning tactical doctrine from manuals while preparing to fight veterans who had been perfecting combined arms warfare since Normandy. Worse, the German force lacked integral reconnaissance units. The Panzer brigades would advance blind, relying on local intelligence and luck to find American positions. In the fog-prone terrain around Arracourt, that blindness would prove catastrophic. Against this, the Americans fielded Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark. CCA was not impressive by numbers. Roughly 163 tanks supporting 10,000 troops spread across a 20-kilometer front. But those tanks were operated by veterans who had fought their way across France since the Normandy breakout in late July. They had learned combined arms warfare in the unforgiving school of bocage hedgerows. They had perfected beat and maneuver tactics during the pursuit across open country. They understood something German doctrine didn't adequately account for, that crew training and tactical flexibility could overcome technical inferiority. The American tanks were M4 Shermans, the ubiquitous medium tank that German crews had learned to despise. The standard model mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical range. Against a Panther positioned hull down at 1,000 meters, a Sherman crew faced near certain death if they tried to engage frontally. The Sherman's armor, while adequate against German Mark IV tanks, offered no protection against the Panther's high-velocity gun. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. A Sherman struggling to penetrate Panther armor from ranges under 500 meters. The technical disparity was overwhelming, and German tactical doctrine was built entirely around exploiting it. But the Sherman possessed advantages that didn't appear in specifications charts. It was mechanically reliable, easy to repair, and available in numbers the Germans couldn't match. Its gyro-stabilized gun allowed crews to fire accurately while moving, something German tanks couldn't accomplish. Its power traverse mechanism rotated the turret faster than the Panther's manual system, allowing Sherman crews to acquire and engage targets more quickly. Most critically, Sherman crews had learned to fight as coordinated teams, using terrain, mutual support, and maneuver to offset their technical disadvantages. They had developed what would later be called combined arms warfare, integrating tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support into a flexible system that German commanders found impossible to counter. The contrast in command philosophy was stark. German doctrine emphasized firepower and protection, assuming that superior equipment would decide engagements. American doctrine emphasized combined arms and maneuver, assuming that coordination and flexibility would create opportunities that equipment alone couldn't achieve. At Arracourt, these competing philosophies would collide under conditions that favored neither side. Heavy fog that negated German range advantages while preventing American air support from intervening. Captain Kenneth Lamison commanded C Company 37th Tank Battalion, part of Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams's armored force, defending the Arracourt sector. Lamison was 26 years old, a Pennsylvania native who had joined the 4th Armored in England during the build-up to D-Day. He had fought through Normandy, across the Seine, through the Marne, learning the bitter lessons that separated living tank commanders from dead ones. He understood that German Panthers were superior machines. He also understood that superior machines, operated by inexperienced crews in unfamiliar terrain, made mistakes. Lamison's C Company held positions along the eastern approaches to Arracourt, watching roads that connected to the German-held towns of Les, Bezange-la-Petite, and Moncourt. The defensive line was thin, extended, and vulnerable. Clark had spread his forces across multiple approach routes, gambling that his crews could use terrain and mobility to defeat concentrated German attacks. It was a calculated risk based on the assumption that American reconnaissance was better, American crew training was superior, and American ability to coordinate artillery and air support would offset German technical advantages. The assumption was about to be tested. On the evening of September 18th, American reconnaissance units reported increased German activity across the front. Radio intercepts suggested major armored formations moving toward Arracourt. Clark prepared his command for attack, but the details remained unclear. Where would the Germans strike? With what force? In what formation? And the answers would emerge from the fog on the morning of September 19th, when Manteuffel unleashed his counteroffensive and discovered that American tankers had learned lessons German doctrine hadn't anticipated. The German attack plan called for 2 Panzer brigades to advance on Arracourt from multiple directions, overwhelming American defenses through weight of numbers and superiority of equipment. The 113th Panzer Brigade would strike from the east, advancing through Les and Bezange-la-Petite directly toward American positions. The 111th Panzer Brigade would attack from the south, bypassing American strongpoints and driving towards CCA headquarters. German planners anticipated quick penetration, followed by exploitation into the American rear areas. They expected Sherman tanks to burn when hit, just as they had throughout the summer. They expected American crews to break and retreat when faced with superior German armor advancing in the fog. They expected the technical superiority of the Panther to decide the battle before American combined arms could organize effective resistance. They were about to learn that expectations built on obsolete intelligence could be as deadly as inadequate armor. The morning of September 19th dawned with visibility less than 600 meters. Thick ground fog covered the low-lying areas around Arracourt, turning the battlefield into a gray twilight where shapes appeared and vanished like ghosts. For German crews advancing without reconnaissance, the fog was a mixed blessing. It concealed their approach from American observation posts and prevented American fighter bombers from intervening. But it also made navigation nearly impossible and coordination between units hopeless. Panther commanders advancing through the mist had no idea where American positions were located, what strength they held, or what obstacles they would encounter. Around 7 o'clock that morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade's 1st Battalion emerged from the fog near Les. Lead Panthers encountered American positions held by 1st Platoon, C Company, under the command of Staff Sergeant Harry Smith. Smith's Shermans were concealed in hull-down positions, invisible in the fog until the Germans closed to point-blank range. When the Panthers appeared at 300 meters, Smith's crews opened fire with devastating effect. 3 Panthers were hit and disabled before German crews could identify the American positions. The surviving Panthers turned southwest, attempting to escape the ambush and regroup. But Lamison had been monitoring the engagement from his command post and had already anticipated the German maneuver. This was the moment that would define the battle. Lamison had 4 Sherman tanks immediately available. The retreating German column numbered 8 Panthers. According to Smith's radio report, the Panthers were attempting to withdraw through Bezange-la-Petite, 3,000 yards south of the contact point. If Lamison could reach the ridge west of Bezange before the Panthers passed through, he could set up a perfect ambush on their exposed flank. It would require his Shermans to race cross-country at maximum speed, arrive at a position they'd never scouted, and set up firing positions in less than 3 minutes. It would require perfect execution under combat stress with zero margin for error, and it would require Lamison to believe that speed and position could overcome the technical superiority of 8 Panther tanks that could each destroy his Shermans from distances his guns couldn't match. Lamison made the decision in seconds. His 4 Shermans, commanded by lieutenants and sergeants who had learned to trust his tactical instincts, roared south across the fog-shrouded terrain, their Continental R975 radial engines screaming at maximum output, their tracks tearing through muddy fields and farm lanes, racing toward a ridge they could barely see through the mist, racing toward 8 German heavy tanks that represented everything American tank crews had learned to fear. They reached the ridge at Bezange-la-Petite with 3 minutes to spare, 3 minutes to position the Shermans hull down behind the crest where their turrets and guns were exposed, but their vulnerable hulls were protected. 3 minutes to identify fields of fire and assign targets. 3 minutes to prepare for an engagement that would either validate Lamison's tactical instincts or result in the destruction of his entire company. Through the fog, the sound of diesel engines grew louder. 8 Panthers, moving in column formation through Bezange-la-Petite, completely unaware that 4 American Shermans sat waiting on their left flank. The German crews were focused on the threat to their north, where Smith's platoon had ambushed their comrades. They were scanning the fog ahead, watching for American positions in the expected locations. They were operating exactly according to German tactical doctrine, seeking to re-establish formation before engaging again at maximum range. They never looked left. Lamison's first 75mm round struck the lead Panther in the side armor at 900 yards. The Sherman's gun, inadequate against frontal armor, was devastating against the Panther's thinner side plates. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Before the Panther crew could react, 3 more Sherman guns opened fire in rapid succession. Each tank commander had been assigned a specific target. Each gunner had achieved a firing solution on Panthers, whose vulnerable flanks were perfectly exposed. The engagement lasted 12 minutes, from first shot to final kill. Lamison's after-action report, filed that evening and preserved in 4th Armored Division archives, provides a clinical account of systematic destruction. First volley, 4 Panthers hit, all disabled or destroyed. The lead German tank burst into flames as ammunition ignited. 2 others shed tracks or suffered engine damage, immobilizing them in the kill zone. The 4th Panther's turret was jammed by a hit that penetrated side armor and destroyed the traverse mechanism. Second volley, the Sherman crews executed a tactical withdrawal, backing below the ridge crest to break line of sight with surviving Panthers. German return fire struck empty air where American tanks had been seconds earlier. The Panthers, trained to engage from static positions, struggled to adapt to enemies that appeared, fired, and vanished. Lamison's tanks repositioned 300 yards south along the reverse slope of the ridge. The maneuver took 90 seconds, executed with the precision of veterans who had practiced hull-down tactics since Normandy. When the Shermans reappeared over the crest, they had clear shots at the remaining Panthers still attempting to organize a defense. Third volley. The final 4 Panthers died in a concentrated barrage that struck side armor, engine decks, and turret rings. 1 Panther attempted to traverse its gun toward the American position, but the Sherman's hydraulic turret was faster. The German crew died before they could fire. Another Panther tried to reverse out of the kill zone, but track damage from the first volley had immobilized it. The final 2 Panthers simply burned, their inexperienced crews abandoning the tanks rather than attempting to fight back. By 08:15, 8 German Panthers sat destroyed or disabled in and around Bezange-la-Petite. Lamison's 4 Shermans had suffered no losses, taken no hits, and were repositioning to avoid German anti-tank guns that would inevitably respond to the engagement. The tactical impossibility had occurred. 4 technically inferior American tanks had destroyed 8 technically superior German tanks in 12 minutes without sustaining damage. The engagement violated every assumption German doctrine had made about tank warfare on the Western Front. German intelligence officers, examining the wreckage later that day, would struggle to explain what happened. The Panthers showed no signs of frontal armor penetration, the kind of damage that would indicate American tanks with upgraded guns. The kill shots had all struck side armor, suggesting the Panthers had been caught in ambush or flanked during maneuver. But how had 4 Shermans positioned themselves on the flank of 8 Panthers without being detected? How had American crews achieved firing solutions and destroyed targets before German crews could return fire? The answers wouldn't emerge from wreckage analysis. They were embedded in tactical doctrine, crew training, and the fundamental understanding that firepower and protection meant nothing if you couldn't bring them to bear on a target. Lamison's engagement near Bezange-la-Petite represented the microcosm of everything that would go wrong for German forces at Arracourt. Superior equipment, operated by inexperienced crews advancing without reconnaissance into terrain held by veterans who understood combined arms warfare. The battle was just beginning. Across the Arracourt sector, German panzer brigades were discovering that fog that protected them from American air power also prevented them from coordinating attacks. Panthers were advancing blindly into killing zones prepared by American defenders who had scouted every ridge, every tree line, every hull-down position in their sectors. German tactical doctrine, built around engaging at maximum range with superior firepower, was collapsing in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 500 meters. American tank commanders like Lamison were exploiting every tactical advantage that didn't appear in technical specifications: faster turret traverse, better crew coordination, superior reconnaissance, and most critically, the understanding that positioning and maneuver could overcome firepower and protection. By mid-morning on September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 43 tanks, most of them factory-fresh Panthers that had never fired a shot in combat. American losses stood at 5, Shermans destroyed, and 7 damaged. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for German planners who had assumed technical superiority would compensate for inexperienced crews. Worse, the Americans were calling in artillery and preparing to counterattack once the fog lifted and air support could intervene. Manteufel's grand counteroffensive, designed to halt Patton's advance and recapture Lorraine, was disintegrating in the fog-shrouded hills around Arracourt, and German intelligence was beginning to file reports that would confuse Wehrmacht analysts for the rest of the war. American Sherman tanks were somehow defeating German Panthers in engagements where the Panthers should have had overwhelming advantages. The quiet revolution in American armored tactics was achieving results that German doctrine couldn't explain and German crews couldn't counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pattern established near Bezange-la-Petite on the morning of September 19th repeated itself across the Arracourt sector throughout the day. American tank crews, using tactics that German doctrine had never anticipated, were systematically destroying Panthers that should have been invincible. The technical specifications that German planners relied upon, superior armor, longer-range guns, higher penetration values, meant nothing when Panthers advancing blindly through fog exposed their flanks to Shermans positioned in ambush. By nightfall, on September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade had suffered catastrophic losses. 43 enemy tanks, mostly factory new Panthers, had been destroyed, while American losses stood at only 6 killed and 13 wounded, with 3 tank destroyers and 5 Sherman tanks knocked out. The exchange ratio was devastating. German commanders had anticipated destroying American armor through weight of firepower and protection. Instead, their inexperienced crews were being picked apart by veterans who understood that positioning mattered more than armor thickness. What confused German intelligence most was the nature of the American success. The Sherman's 75mm turret could rotate 360 degrees in 15 seconds with power traverse. The Panther, by contrast, used a hydraulic traverse system powered by the main engine. At maximum engine revolutions, the Panther could complete a full turret rotation in 18 seconds, but at normal operating speeds, this extended significantly. The 3-second advantage seemed trivial in isolation, but in combat, where targets appeared and disappeared in seconds, it was decisive. More critically, the Sherman's power traverse was independent of engine speed. A Sherman crew waiting in ambush with engines idling could traverse their turret at full speed. A Panther crew in the same position had to rev their engine to maximum to achieve comparable traverse rates, announcing their position through noise and exhaust. The tactical implications were profound. Sherman crews could position themselves, shut down to minimal power, and wait in concealment. When targets appeared, they could traverse and fire without betraying their position through engine noise. Panther crews, attempting the same tactic, found themselves unable to traverse quickly enough to engage fleeting targets. The Germans had optimized their tanks for long-range gunnery duels where traverse speed mattered less than armor and firepower. The Americans had created a system that excelled at close-range ambushes where rapid target acquisition decided engagements. At Arracourt, terrain and weather favored the American approach. But German intelligence reports filed on September 19th showed no awareness that American tactics had evolved. The reports described heavy losses to American fire, but attributed them to poor reconnaissance and unfortunate positioning. German analysts assumed the problem was tactical execution, not fundamental doctrine. They recommended better scouting, tighter formations, and more aggressive use of superior range. They never identified the Sherman's faster turret traverse, superior crew coordination, or the Americans' systematic exploitation of terrain as factors in their defeats. The fighting continued through September 20th as Manteuffel committed additional forces in a desperate attempt to salvage his counteroffensive. The 11th Panzer Division, a veteran unit from the Eastern Front, joined the assault with its remaining armor. German commanders expected that experienced crews would succeed where the Green Panzer Brigades had failed. They were mistaken. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, had positioned his forces to exploit every lesson learned on September 19th. His tank companies occupied hold-down positions on commanding ridges with clear fields of fire across German approach routes. His crews had scouted their sectors, identifying routes for rapid repositioning and fallback positions if pressed. His artillery was registered on likely German assembly areas. When the German attack came, Abrams executed a defensive masterpiece that would be studied at Fort Knox for decades. His forward positions engaged German armor at close range, inflicting casualties and forcing the Germans to deploy. As Panthers attempted to maneuver for better firing positions, American artillery saturated their assembly areas. When German crews tried to withdraw and regroup, American tanks pursued from hull-down positions, hitting vulnerable side armor. The engagement demonstrated combined arms warfare at its finest. Tank destroyers provided mobile anti-tank capability. Infantry secured flanks and prevented German infiltration. Artillery disrupted German formations before they could coordinate attacks. Air support, when the fog finally lifted around noon, devastated German armor caught in the open. Major Charles Carpenter, flying his Piper L-4 Cub observation aircraft, epitomized the innovation that characterized American operations. Carpenter had armed his light aircraft with bazooka rockets and, when the fog lifted, spotted a company of German Panther tanks advancing toward Arracourt and dove through German ground fire in repeated passes, firing all his bazooka rockets at the German armor. The sight of a fragile observation plane attacking 45-ton Panthers seemed absurd, but Carpenter's attacks forced German crews to button up their hatches and lose situational awareness. While they were blind and immobile, American ground forces maneuvered for killing shots. The psychological impact was profound. German tank commanders, trained to dominate battlefields through superior technology, found themselves harassed by aircraft they couldn't effectively engage, while ground forces they couldn't see destroyed their vehicles. The sense of invulnerability that Panther crews had developed fighting inferior Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front evaporated in the fog and confusion of Lorraine. By September 22nd, the pattern was established and the outcome inevitable. The tank battles fought from September 19th through 22nd had cost CCA 14 M4 Sherman medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks totally destroyed, with 25 killed and 88 wounded. German losses were catastrophic. 2 Panzer brigades had been effectively destroyed as cohesive combat units without achieving any of their objectives. The disparity in casualties revealed the fundamental shift in armored warfare that German commanders had failed to recognize. Technical superiority in individual tanks meant nothing if those tanks were operated by inexperienced crews, committed piecemeal without reconnaissance, and employed according to doctrine that assumed static engagements at maximum range. American inferiority in tank versus tank capability was irrelevant when American commanders refused to fight tank versus tank. They fought system versus tank, employing coordinated, combined arms that overwhelmed German technical advantages through superior tactics, training, and battlefield awareness. German intelligence struggled to explain the discrepancy. Reports filed to 5th Panzer Army headquarters described American positions as heavily fortified, suggesting that German forces had attacked prepared defenses rather than encountering a mobile defense. Other reports claimed American tanks possessed upgraded guns or ammunition, attempting to explain penetrations that shouldn't have occurred given known Sherman capabilities. Some reports noted unusually effective American artillery and air support, attributing losses to combined arms rather than tank combat. None identified the core issue. American tank crews had learned to fight differently than German doctrine anticipated. They had abandoned the stand-up gunnery duels that German training emphasized and embraced maneuver warfare that exploited every advantage that didn't appear in technical specifications. Faster turret traverse, better crew coordination, superior reconnaissance, and willingness to break contact and reposition, rather than fight losing engagements. The battles continued through September 29th as Manteuffel, under pressure from Hitler to show results, committed his dwindling forces to increasingly desperate attacks. By September 26th, the 5th Panzer Army had been reduced to only 25 operational tanks and pressed its attacks unsuccessfully for 3 more days until clearing weather and increased American air activity forced the Germans to suspend their counteroffensive and begin a retreat toward the German frontier. The final casualty statistics told the story of a disaster. In the Arracourt area, during September, the 5th Panzer Army lost 118 Panther battle tanks, 101 Panzer IV battle tanks, and 122 Jagdpanzer and STUG tank destroyers and assault guns. The Americans, by contrast, lost 151 M4 Sherman medium tanks, 49 M5A1 light tanks, and several dozens of M10 and M18 tank destroyers across the entire Lorraine campaign. When losses were calculated against objectives achieved, the disparity became even more stark. The Germans had failed to recapture any significant territory, failed to eliminate the American bridgehead, and failed to halt Patton's Third Army. They had expended irreplaceable armor and veteran crews in exchanges that consistently favored American forces. The Americans had defended their positions, preserved their logistical lines, and demonstrated that Sherman tanks, properly employed, could defeat technically superior German armor through superior tactics and coordination. The intelligence failure extended to the highest levels of German command. Wehrmacht situation reports from late September continued to cite American tank vulnerability as a known factor in operational planning. German tactical bulletins distributed to panzer crews in October 1944 still emphasized engaging American armor at maximum range, where German guns enjoyed superiority. Training materials prepared for replacement crews made no mention of American advantages in turret traverse, crew coordination, or combined arms integration. German armor doctrine remained frozen around assumptions that had been systematically disproven in the hedgerows of Normandy and the rolling hills of Lorraine. The failure to adapt would cost German forces dearly in the months ahead. As American armored divisions pushed toward the German border, they carried with them the tactical lessons learned at Arracourt. Sherman crews understood that they could defeat Panthers through positioning and maneuver. American commanders understood that combined arms coordination could overwhelm German technical advantages. American doctrine evolved to emphasize the tactics that had proven successful, creating a systematic approach to defeating German armor that worked regardless of individual equipment capabilities. German forces, meanwhile, continued to receive Panthers and commit them to battle according to doctrine that emphasized static gunnery and technical superiority. They continued to train crews on the assumption that armor thickness and gun performance would decide engagements. They continued to organize attacks around massed armor assaults without adequate reconnaissance or combined arms support. The contrast became apparent in every subsequent engagement. At the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, German panzer divisions achieved initial surprise and penetrated American lines through weight of numbers and weather that grounded American air support. But when American armored forces counterattacked, they employed the same tactics that had succeeded at Arracourt: mobility, positioning, combined arms coordination, and aggressive maneuver that negated German technical advantages. The results were predictable. German Panthers continued to burn when flanked by maneuvering Shermans. German crews continued to be surprised by American tanks that appeared in unexpected positions. German commanders continued to commit armor piecemeal, allowing American forces to defeat them in detail. Captain Kenneth Lamison's engagement near Bezange-la-Petite on September 19th represented the microcosm of this larger pattern. One American officer with 4 tanks exploiting speed and positioning to destroy 8 technically superior German tanks in 12 minutes. The engagement seemed impossible by German tactical doctrine. It was routine by American tactical practice. Lamison survived the war and returned to Pennsylvania, where he lived until 1992. He rarely spoke about Arracourt, treating his actions as unremarkable applications of standard tactics rather than exceptional achievements. In his after-action reports and the few interviews he gave to military historians, Lamison emphasized that any well-trained Sherman crew could have accomplished the same result given similar circumstances. That modesty obscured the revolutionary nature of what American armor had achieved at Arracourt. They had proven that tactical excellence could overcome technical inferiority. They had demonstrated that combined arms coordination was more decisive than individual platform capabilities. They had shown that doctrine built around maneuver and positioning could systematically defeat doctrine built around firepower and protection. The Germans never fully understood what had changed. Their post-battle analyses attributed American success to material superiority, citing overwhelming numbers of tanks and unlimited air support. They noted American advantages in logistics and reconnaissance. They acknowledged that inexperienced German crews had performed poorly against veteran American tankers. But they never identified the core revolution in American tactical doctrine. They never recognized that the Sherman's faster turret traverse enabled tactics that German tanks couldn't counter. They never understood that American combined arms integration had created a system where individual tank capabilities mattered less than coordinated team performance. They never adapted their doctrine to account for enemies who refused to fight the way German training assumed they would. The failure to decode American tactical innovations at Arracourt exemplified a broader German intelligence failure that plagued Wehrmacht operations throughout the final year of the war. German commanders remained convinced that technical superiority would decide battles, even as evidence mounted that American tactical superiority was systematically defeating German technology. German military culture, built around engineering excellence and technical precision, struggled to comprehend enemies who achieved success through improvisation, coordination, and tactical flexibility rather than superior equipment. The mindset that produced the Panther, the Tiger, and other technically magnificent weapons assumed that quality would overcome quantity. The Americans proved that quality of doctrine and training could overcome quality of equipment. At Arracourt, that proof cost the 5th Panzer Army over 260 tanks and effectively ended any German hope of halting Patton's Third Army short of the German border. The broader implications extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. American armored doctrine, validated at Arracourt and refined through subsequent battles, would influence tank warfare for decades. The emphasis on combined arms, mobile defense, and exploitation of tactical advantages rather than technical superiority became foundational principles of American armor employment. The lessons learned facing Panthers in Lorraine would inform American responses to Soviet armor in Korea. shaping doctrine that emphasized maneuver and coordination over simple platform comparison. German armor doctrine, by contrast, reached its peak of technical sophistication at Arracourt and began a terminal decline. The Panthers, committed to battle in September 1944, represented the finest medium tanks Germany would produce during the war. They were superior to Shermans in nearly every measurable specification: armor thickness, gun performance, survivability against frontal hits. They were also operated by increasingly inexperienced crews, committed according to increasingly obsolete doctrine and employed in ways that negated their technical advantages, while exposing their tactical vulnerabilities. The quiet revolution in American armored tactics that Captain Lamison exemplified near Bezange-la-Petite represented a shift in warfare that German commanders recognized too late to counter. By the time Wehrmacht tactical bulletins began acknowledging American advantages in crew training and combined arms coordination, German armor production was collapsing and veteran crews were irreplaceable. The technical excellence that German engineering culture prized had been systematically defeated by tactical excellence that American combat experience had developed. Lamison's 4 Shermans destroying 8 Panthers in 12 minutes wasn't an exception to the rule. It was the rule, repeated across dozens of engagements at Arracourt and hundreds more in the battles that followed. American crews had learned to win not by matching German technology, but by refusing to fight on German terms. They had changed the game, and German intelligence never decoded the change. Hey, thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.